Tom mentioned, things have changed fairly dramatically in Montana's public education over time. Originally, Montana's schools were funded almost entirely through local property taxes. Now, the problem with this was that some schools had a lot of property wealth to draw from, and other schools did not, or they didn't have enough for the number of kids that they needed to educate. So, over the years, the Montana school funding formula evolved to make things a little bit more equitable between these different schools, okay? Except, all the way up until 1988, the funding formula was still not very equitable. You would have some communities that had thousands of dollars more per kid to educate their students than some of our more rural communities. And so there were a few equity lawsuits filed in 1988 and 1993 stating that these persistent inequities meant that we weren't fulfilling our constitutional duty, as Tom mentioned, for a quality public education and an equal opportunity for all kids to have a good education. So this set up a few things. It set up our guaranteed tax base, and what that means is we take taxes from the whole state, we put them into a pot, and then we redistribute them. All right, so I'm going to show you some graphics here. The next piece, besides just equity, is adequacy. We could make an equitable funding formula by lowering the amount of funding, right, in those bigger districts. But that doesn't mean that we're providing for an adequate education. And this is what Tom mentioned with the Montana Quality Education Coalition. So in 2004, there was a lawsuit, Columbia Falls versus Montana, and Judge Sherlock found that the state contribution to education spending was not adequate to provide this basic system of free, quality public elementary and secondary schools. Again, that word quality is very important here. In 2005, the legislature specified a definition of what quality means, and we had some evolutions that gave us the funding formula we have today that I'm going to show you. Now, the funding formula has to be reviewed every 10 years. It was reviewed in 2015. There were a lot of recommendations of changes that should be made, and hardly any of those changes were made. So we are working with, almost 20 years later, almost the exact same formula that we had in 2005. And education has changed a lot since then. So you've probably seen in the news that there are a lot of school districts talking about how the funding formula is not adequate for the education they're expected to provide today, right? And so I'm gonna try my best to explain why that is. So here we have a little bit of a graphic. Let's shift this over a little bit. Okay, and this kind of shows you the basics of how Montana schools are funded. Okay, so if you start from the bottom, there are components that are funded by the state for specific purposes, okay? And then we have a specific special education payment, and that's given to every district based on the total number of kids they have, not the number of kids with disabilities, the total number of students, okay? And then we have a basic entitlement. And so that's pretty much, you're running a school, you get a lump sum of money, right, to run that school. And you can have some increments on that for larger districts. But originally, it was just, you run a school, you get a lump sum of money no matter how big your school is, okay? And then we have this purple section that gets us up to base. And that is largely dependent on per pupil funding. So that's the amount of money per student, okay? Now this becomes really important when we talk about the charter school debate, right? Because if you have a private charter school that is taking students away from a public school, those students' funding leaves with them, okay? So that is why this is such a big deal for school funding, is because so much of the formula is dependent on that per pupil amount, right? The amount you get for each kid, okay? So there are local levies and other funding sources, okay, that can get you from that base amount to the maximum budget. So the base amount is what will be funded by the state. It's a combination of state and local resources, but every school district is guaranteed that base amount. To get to 100%, the district has to ask for additional levies from local taxpayers, okay? So that's why you will see that your maybe local school or local schools in the surrounding area are asking for a levy for additional property taxes. That's because that's the amount that needs to get from that base to that max. Now, part of why this is really important, if your local school is only funded at that 80%, which most rural schools in Montana are, pretty close to that 80%, you only get 80% of the inflationary increase from the state legislature, okay? So those schools are falling further and further behind as school funding does not keep up with inflation, right? So this graph shows what it would look like for an individual school, okay? So we still have those same components at the bottom, those state-funded components, the special education component, and then every school gets some direct state aid that they get money from the state, okay? Then it gets a little bit more complicated. So if you look at 6 and 7, okay, this was the big piece that was adopted during those equity lawsuits that I was talking about, okay? So some school districts, for example, Browning School District, okay, they have hardly any property that is taxable, right? A lot of it is federal land, reservation land, that sort of thing. So they don't have much, number 7 right there, they don't have a lot of property taxes that they can use to fund their schools. So they're going to get more of that green area, guaranteed tax base from the state to get them up to that base level, right? Okay, a school like Big Sky, very high property wealth, not very many students, right? They can fund that amount fully through their local property taxes. They don't need any help from the state, okay? Now, where this ties in for you, how many folks have heard about the controversy about the 95 mils tax rates? How you're probably gonna get a slightly complicated tax bill here soon, depending on what county you're in. Okay, so that 95 mil property taxes goes into this special account called the school equalization account. And that is what funds that number 6 green guaranteed tax base. So we collect property taxes from all over the state, we put it in one pot, okay, and then it's distributed to schools as needed. Where this gets confusing is just because your property taxes went up, that doesn't mean that the funding for your local school went up, right? That means there might be a little bit more money in that state equalization account, but that doesn't automatically go to your school. The state legislature has to determine how much money your school is allocated to budget, right? To get up to that base and maximum amount. And the Office of Public Instruction is limited to only asking for a 3% inflationary increase. They cannot ask for more than that, okay? So even if your property taxes went up more than that, that money went into that school equalization account, that doesn't mean your school is gonna directly get that money. I know that's very confusing. If you have questions about that, please write it down and I'd be happy to address them during the Q&A portion, okay? And so what this means is that a lot of schools are starting to ask more of their local taxpayers to keep up with the increased costs, right? Now, one other important thing that I think there are a lot of misconceptions about is, okay, the school gets this money, right, that they've been budgeted from the state. Do they just have free reign to use it however they want? They absolutely do not. There are a lot of restrictions on it, okay? So there are these different buckets of funding. The funding formula we just talked about funds the general fund at the top left up there. And that is what we use for most school operations, right? Curriculum, staff salaries, right? Those sort of things, sometimes keeping the lights on. There's a little bit of flexibility there, right? But most of the day-to-day functions of running a school come out of that general fund, okay? Then you have some other funds, building reserve funds. Some districts have run technology levies. That's very common right now in this particular spring election cycle, right? There's a transportation fund, and that can only be used for transportation, right? There's a tuition fund that can only be used for kiddos that might need another placement, right? So the school doesn't have total freedom to take that money and use it for whatever it needs, right? It has a lot of restrictions on that. The other big thing is, because some of these other buckets might not be adequate, right? So for example, in Helena, we ran a technology levy in 2005. At that point, nobody even had an iPhone, right? And so that levy is run at, there's $100 per kid for technology. That's not enough in 2024, right? So as a community, Helena has decided to rerun a technology levy because right now they're pulling a lot of money out of that general fund to be able to get Chromebooks for kids and everything they need in a 21st century learning environment. And so they don't have as much in their general fund to pay teachers, right? All of those basic things, okay? So a little bit just about what we can do about this, because I know school funding is on a lot of folks' minds. First of all, if your community is running a levy, I know it's hard with our other property taxes going up, but they need that money right now more than ever, okay? So if you can do things to support your local community levy, that would be great, okay? Additionally, we can advance change by communicating with the legislature early and often about how this is affecting our schools. That's something that our organization really aims to do, is to be able to connect people that really care about their local public schools with the legislative process or the Board of Public Education or the Office of Public Instruction, and try to enable folks to then share things with the legislature. I do have my card over there. If you'd like it, you can sign up for our email on our website, and I will send you all the information in as simplified of a fashion as I possibly can. And then the legislature will have a decennial review, so every 10 years, that's coming up in 2025, 2026 interim, where they will relook at the funding formula. They might conduct another adequacy study to see, is the funding we're giving schools actually enough for the outcomes we expect of schools, right? And they will really dive into that and make recommendations for the 2027 session. But I think we're gonna need to do more in that 2025 session, because the funding formula is not working now and schools are struggling, right? So we can request an adequacy study. We can provide funding for like the school facilities program, which is specifically, the goal is to help schools maintain deferred maintenance costs on their buildings. And that throughout the decades has been funded and not funded and funded and not funded and completely inconsistent. So we can advocate for things like that. We can revise simple things like a transportation funding policy to allow schools more flexibility in how they use those funds, right? So there are a lot of small tweaks that we as an organization and other organizations that Tom mentioned, like the School Boards Association, MFPE, things like that, will be advocating for in the next session to try to help these schools out, okay? But the big push will be during that 2025-2026 interim. So, Mindy, can we send this presentation out to folks if they'd like? Okay, great. Because I have a lot of links on here that can, if you want to dive in a little bit deeper. But I just think our biggest focus going into the next session, and as we look into communicating with OPI, is going to really be, is the funding adequate? Is this formula that we've had for 20 years working? How can we update it so that our schools that we so much care about in our local communities can have the adequate funding they need to provide that quality education that's instilled in our Constitution? So with that, I'll hand it over to Shannon.